Here we are at the second of the two reading comprehension passages that are part of reading comprehension drill set number 5 over at lawhub.lsac.org. And as always, we're going to select one of the highlight colors as we encounter this first question of the passage and ignore the question stem. We're going to go straight to engaging in an upfront read of this passage about Richard L. Jackson's most recent book. And we're going to read each paragraph independently, stop, consider what the single most important sentence is from the author's perspective, highlight that sentence, and potentially one additional sentence to give enough narrative context as we focus solely on the big picture main idea of the passage to allow us to then address the main idea questions in subsequent videos. So let's read from the top. Richard L. Jackson's most recent book, Black Writers in Latin America, continues the task of his previous project, The Black Image in Latin American Literature. But whereas the earlier work examined ethnic themes in the writings of both Black and non-Black authors, the new study examines only Black writers living in Latin America, that is, African Hispanic writers. Consequently, there's a shift in emphasis. While the earlier book studied various attitudes toward Black people in Latin America as revealed in a wide range of literature, the later work examines the Black representation of Black consciousness in Spanish American literature from the early 19th century to the present. And so this is largely just providing background information. And we, to a degree, need to identify what background information is most accessible. And I would argue that it's this part about the earlier work examining both Black and non-Black authors, but the new work being only about Black writers living in Latin America. And knowing what the earlier work and the newer work is will require highlighting this opening sentence as well. So now that we've got those two sentences highlighted to give context of the big picture from the first paragraph, we can then engage the second paragraph, read it in full, and then determine what is the single most important sentence or two to highlight to continue that narrative main idea. So in Black Writers in Latin America, Jackson states that personal identification with Blackness and personal experience with the Black experience have a great deal to do with a Black writer's choice of words, symbols, and images. He goes on to argue that only Black writers have the necessary insight and mastery of the appropriate techniques to depict their situation authentically. In this regard, Jackson joins a number of other North American critics who tend to conceptualize African Hispanic literature as culturally autonomous with its own style and themes deriving primarily from the experience of oppression in African Hispanic history. Critics influenced by the Latin American ideal of racial blending, on the other hand, believe that Black and non-Black writers share the same cultural context and that given comparable talent, both are clearly equally equipped to overcome their ethnocentrism. Although Jackson clearly embraces the North American perspective, he does concede in his introduction that most African Hispanic writers espouse integration rather than separatism. So we need to be focused on Richard L. Jackson and what's happening in this new book, where Jackson states that personal identification with Blackness and personal experience with the Black experience have a great deal to do with a Black writer's choice of words, symbols, and images. But we know that critics influenced by the Latin American ideal of racial blending, on the other hand, believe that Black and non-Black writers share the same cultural context and that given comparable talent, both are equally equipped to overcome their ethnocentrism. So we've probably got to highlight both of the sides of this coin. So we know that we've got these critics that are going to disagree with Jackson, and Jackson is the one who says that he's focusing only on Black writers as the subject of Black writers in Latin America, able to write about the Black experience within the African Hispanic milieu, as it were. And you can read your highlights as you go to confirm that you've got the overall narrative. So Richard L. Jackson's most recent book, Black Writers in Latin America, continues the task of his previous project, The Black Image in Latin American Literature. But whereas the earlier work examined ethnic themes in the writings of both Black and non-Black authors, The new study examines only black writers living in Latin America, that is, African Hispanic writers. In Black Writers in Latin America, Jackson states that personal identification with blackness and personal experience with the black experience have a great deal to do with a black writer's choice of words, symbols, and images. Critics influenced by the Latin American ideal of racial blending, on the other hand, believe that black and non-black writers share the same cultural context and that given comparable talent, both are equally equipped to overcome their ethnocentrism. And hopefully we understand that we're in the middle of this kind of debate, but we don't have the author's position yet, so we'll have to scroll on down and frame up this final paragraph as well. We'll read it in full and then we'll highlight similarly one or two sentences that hopefully capture the overall narrative and kind of put a button on this story, as it were. Picking up from the top of this final paragraph, at times Jackson's own analysis reveals the problems inherent in using ethnicity as the primary basis for critical judgment. The textual evidence he cites sometimes subverts the intent to find common tendencies among all writers of a particular racial group. So we finally have the author's perspective. The author's not really a fan of Jackson necessarily, but we don't want to highlight as we go. We need to read the full thing and make sure that there's no other sentence that better captures the author's overall position on this topic. So continuing, for example, in his chapter on Nicolas Guillen, Jackson attempts to dissociate the black Cuban poet from the Negrista movement, claiming that rather than associate Guillen with poetic negrism, we should see his dramatic conversion to blackness in the late 1920s and the early 1930s as a reaction against this white literary fad that was sweeping the world. Admittedly, several of Guillen's poems from the 1920s show an awareness of social ills like poverty, unemployment, and racial discrimination that is absent from the work of peers influenced by the Negrista movement. But it is difficult to argue that Guillen's portraits of black people in poems from the early 1930s, such as Canto Negro and Rumba, are more authentic and less superficial than those in Luis Pales Matos's Danza Negra or Emilio Bayagas's Alegia de Maria Belén Chacon. And if you're having trouble with pronunciations, you can just say EDMBC. The name does not matter. You don't need to waste time trying to pronounce it. This effort to distance Guillen from his Hispanic colleagues thus fails, given the very texts Jackson uses to demonstrate his points. And hopefully we can identify that we've got a whole lot of evidence in the middle, but we're going to have to highlight the opening and closing sentences to capture the author's perspective. Now, in order to maintain the narrative, I can leave out transition terms to make it flow a little bit better. So we know effort to distance Guillen from his Hispanic colleagues fails, given the very text Jackson uses to demonstrate his points, to eliminate having to use that referent of this and thus. So let's just start at the top and make sure that we've got an overall coherent narrative that we can then use to go through the main idea task of this problem. So Richard L. Jackson's most recent book, Black Writers in Latin America, continues the task of his previous project, The Black Image in Latin American Literature. But whereas the earlier work examined ethnic themes in the writings of both black and non-black authors, the new study examines only black writers living in Latin America, that is, African Hispanic writers. In Black Writers in Latin America, Jackson states that personal identification with blackness and personal experience with the black experience have a great deal to do with a black writer's choice of words, symbols, and images. Critics influenced by the Latin American ideal of racial blending, on the other hand, believe that black and non-black writers share the same cultural context and that given comparable talent, both are equally equipped to overcome their ethnocentrism. At times, Jackson's own analysis reveals the problems inherent in using ethnicity as the primary basis for critical judgment. The textual evidence he cites sometimes subverts the intent to find common tendencies among all writers of a particular racial group. Effort to distance Guillen from his Hispanic colleagues fails, given the very text Jackson uses to demonstrate his points. So if I want to refer back to Guillen, I can just underline the name, understanding that who it was is ultimately relatively irrelevant to the actual argument of the author that Jackson's wrong, basically, from the author's perspective. So now we're going to go to our question stem, highlight the task, which is to identify the main idea of the passage, and we're going to try to find one of these answer choices that broadly says, here we introduce this new book of Jackson, and the author disagrees with its only black people can talk about Latin American black writers and black writing. So Let's talk about choice A first. A central feature of Jackson's approach to African Hispanic literature, shared by some other critics, can be shown to have significant weaknesses. I mean, it's bland LSAT language, but the central feature would be that idea that it's only focusing on people who are black to comment on the black Hispanic experience. So that central feature is shown to have significant weaknesses. I probably highlight this, and if I'm feeling bold and I'm aiming for 165 plus, I might go ahead and select A right now and allow myself to go very briskly through the remaining answer choices. But for the purposes of this video, we'll find specific reasons that each of the following choices are wrong. So B, Jackson's reliance on the Latin American perspective of racial blending and integration in his analysis of African Hispanic literature leads him to make at least one flawed argument. Well, it's not reliance on the perspective of racial blending. He's focused solely on black writers, not blending them, so B actually has the information from the passage and the author's argument backwards. Then, choice C, the African Hispanic authors, poets, and texts that Jackson chooses to analyze in his most recent book are unrepresentative of Spanish American literature and thus lead him to faulty conclusions. Well, we're not really talking about Spanish American, we're talking about Latin American. So there are some very subtle term shifts that we can use as reasons to eliminate, and C, again, if we're going briskly, would allow us to do that pretty quickly. Then choice D, Jackson's emphasis on black writers' contributions to African Hispanic literature in his latest book undercuts the assumptions underlying his own previous work on Spanish American literature. Well, again, we're focused more on Latin American literature. And secondly, we're no longer concerned with his previous work. As soon as we get out of that first paragraph, we're not talking about the black image in Latin American literature any longer, so we can eliminate choice D as well. And then choice E, Jackson's treatment of Guillen reveals a misplaced effort to integrate African Hispanic writers into worldwide literary movements. Worldwide literary movements, that's an entirely new subject, just at its face. So we should be able to eliminate E. And again, if you are moving briskly trying to get through all four passages of a reading comprehension section because you're aiming for 160, 165, or 170 plus, you probably would have gotten to the correct answer of A a while ago, and we'll move on to the remaining questions in our subsequent videos.